There are seasons in life when fear tries to rise quietly within the heart, not always in loud ways, but in subtle thoughts about tomorrow, about provision, about uncertainty, about what may or may not happen. In those moments, the human soul begins to lean toward anxiety, and yet there is a divine invitation that interrupts every fearful thought with truth that is far greater than what we can see or feel. The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear? When those words settle into the spirit, they do not merely become a statement to memorize, they become a foundation to stand upon. Light speaks of direction in darkness, clarity in confusion, and hope in despair. Salvation speaks of rescue, deliverance, and safety that does not depend on circumstances. When God becomes both light and salvation in a person's life, fear loses its authority. Fear may still knock, but it can no longer rule. There are moments when life feels like an unfolding battle. Not always physical, but emotional, mental, and spiritual. Thoughts can become battles. Decisions can feel heavy. The unknown can feel overwhelming. Yet in the midst of all of this, there is a question that rises from the heart of Scripture: whom shall I fear? Not because there's nothing to be afraid of in the natural sense, but because there is someone greater than every threat combined. When the presence of God becomes real to a person, fear begins to lose its grip in proportion to how clearly God is seen. When the wicked came against me to eat up my flesh, they stumbled and fell. Life sometimes brings opposition that feels unfair, unexpected, and even painful. There are seasons when people misunderstand, when doors close, when accusations rise, when plans collapse. Yet there is a hidden truth in the way God sustains his people. Not every attack succeeds. Not every opposition prevails. Not every threat defines the outcome. There is a divine hand that preserves, protects, and upholds, even when the pressure feels overwhelming. Though an army may encamp against me, my heart shall not fear. This is not human confidence. This is spiritual stability rooted in the presence of God. Armies represent overwhelming odds, situations that appear impossible to overcome. Yet the heart that has learned to trust God does not measure reality only by what is visible. It measures reality by who is present in the unseen. Courage is not the absence of pressure. It is the presence of trust. One thing I have desired of the Lord, that will I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life. This reveals the center of spiritual strength, not merely escaping trouble, not merely receiving answers, but abiding in presence. Many people seek God for what he can provide, but peace comes when a person begins to seek God for who he is. Dwelling speaks of staying, remaining, not visiting God only in emergencies, but learning to live in awareness of him continually. To behold the beauty of the Lord and to inquire in his temple, there is transformation that takes place when the focus shifts from problems to presence. Beauty here speaks of character, holiness, faithfulness, mercy, and wisdom. The more a person beholds God, the less intimidating life's uncertainties become. The heart is shaped not by the size of the problem, but by the greatness of the one being worshiped. For in the time of trouble he shall hide me in his pavilion. In the secret place of his tabernacle he shall hide me. There is a divine covering that cannot be seen with natural eyes. It is not always the removal of trouble, but often the preservation within it. The secret place is not a physical location, but a spiritual reality of closeness with God. It is the place where anxiety loses its voice and trust becomes stronger than fear. He shall set me high upon a rock. Stability comes from elevation in God's perspective. When life is viewed only from ground level, everything feels overwhelming. But when the soul is lifted into God's truth, the same situations appear differently. The rock represents stability that cannot be shaken by shifting circumstances. What once felt like defeat begins to look like positioning for growth. And now my head shall be lifted up above my enemies all around me. This lifting is not self-produced. It is the result of divine intervention. There are battles that cannot be won by human effort alone. There are situations that require God's hand to shift what human strength cannot change. When God lifts a person, no opposition can ultimately suppress what he has ordained. Therefore, I will offer sacrifices of joy in his tabernacle. Worship becomes the response of trust, not only when everything is perfect, but even in the middle of uncertainty. Sacrifice implies that praise is not always based on feelings, but on decision. Joy becomes an offering when it is given in moments where it is not naturally easy. Hear, O Lord, when I cry with my voice. There is something powerful about bringing every concern to God honestly, not pretending, not hiding, not masking pain. Prayer is not performance. It is relationship. God is not distant from the cries of his people. Every sincere prayer is heard even when silence feels present. When you said, seek my face, my heart said to you, your face, Lord, I will seek. This is the turning point of spiritual maturity, when God's invitation becomes the soul's response. Seeking his face means seeking his presence above his hand. It is choosing intimacy over mere answers. It is choosing relationship over relief alone. And in that pursuit, something begins to shift within the heart where peace becomes less dependent on outcomes. Do not hide your face from me. Do not turn your servant away in anger. The honesty of this prayer reveals that even strong believers experience moments of vulnerability. Yet even in that vulnerability, there is trust that God remains attentive. The heart that seeks him does not let go even when emotions fluctuate. It holds on through prayer, through worship, through waiting. Teach me your way, O Lord, and lead me in a smooth path because of my enemies. Guidance becomes essential when pressure increases. Without divine direction, human reasoning can easily become overwhelmed. But when God leads, even difficult paths become manageable. The way may not always be easy, but it becomes purposeful. Do not deliver me to the will of my adversaries, for false witnesses have risen against me. This reflects moments when life feels unjust, when truth seems challenged, when opposition appears stronger than fairness. Yet even then, God remains the defender of those who trust him. No accusation has the final word over a life held by God. I would have lost heart unless I had believed that I would see the goodness of the Lord in the land of the living. Fear is one of the most common battles every human being faces, yet it is also one of the most misunderstood struggles of the heart. It does not always appear as panic or visible anxiety. Sometimes it shows up as quiet uncertainty, hesitation in decision-making, or an internal pressure about what tomorrow may bring. The mind begins to imagine outcomes that have not yet happened, and the heart begins to react to situations that are not even present. In such moments, the human soul becomes vulnerable, not because circumstances are always dangerous, but because perception becomes heavier than truth. This is why the foundation of overcoming fear is not found in changing circumstances first, but in changing what the heart believes about God. When it is declared that the Lord is light, it speaks directly into the darkness that fear tries to create. Darkness in a spiritual sense is not merely the absence of physical light. It represents confusion, lack of clarity, and inability to see what is ahead. Fear grows in environments where clarity is missing. When a person does not know what will happen, fear begins to write its own assumptions. But when God is recognized as light, he becomes the source of understanding, direction, and perspective. Light reveals what is real and removes the power of imagination that fear often uses as its strongest weapon. In the presence of divine light, the unknown does not disappear, but it no longer controls the heart. Salvation, in its deepest sense, is not only about eternal deliverance, but also about present rescue. It means that God is actively involved in preserving, protecting, and guiding a person's life. When a person internalizes that God is their salvation, it changes how they respond to threats, whether physical, emotional, or mental. Instead of reacting as though everything depends on human strength, there is a quiet confidence that a higher power is at work, even when it is not visible. This understanding weakens fear because fear thrives on the belief that a person is alone in their struggle. But salvation reminds the heart that it is never alone. One of the most powerful questions that emerges from this truth is, whom shall I fear? This is not a question of ignorance, but a declaration of comparison. It places every possible threat beside the greatness of God. When fear is examined closely, it often exaggerates the size of problems and minimizes the presence of God. But when truth takes its rightful place, the comparison changes. No situation, no person, no future uncertainty can outweigh the strength, wisdom, and authority of God. This does not mean challenges do not exist, but it means they no longer hold ultimate power over the believer's heart. Fear also loses strength when a person begins to understand that God is not only powerful in theory, but present in reality. Many people acknowledge the existence of God, but struggle to experience His presence in daily life. However, spiritual stability grows when God is no longer seen as distant, but as near, involved, and attentive. When a person becomes aware of God's nearness, fear begins to lose its intensity because isolation is one of its strongest fuels. Fear grows louder in silence, but it weakens in presence. The awareness of God's nearness transforms solitude into companionship and uncertainty into trust. Life inevitably brings moments where external pressures feel overwhelming. These are the seasons where fear tries to amplify itself through circumstances that seem beyond human control. It may come through financial uncertainty, health concerns, relationship struggles, or unexpected changes in life direction. In such times, the natural response is to attempt control. Yet control is often an illusion that increases anxiety rather than reducing it. The deeper invitation in such moments is not control, but trust. Trust does not deny reality, but it refuses to allow reality to become greater than God. When the heart begins to trust God as light and salvation, something subtle but powerful happens internally. The imagination begins to calm. The thoughts that once ran toward worst-case scenarios begin to slow down. The emotional weight that once felt heavy begins to lift. This does not always happen instantly, but gradually the inner world begins to align with truth rather than fear. The mind learns to pause before reacting, and the spirit learns to rest even in uncertainty. There is also a transformation that takes place in identity. Fear often tries to define a person by what they might lose, what they lack, or what they cannot control. But when God becomes light and salvation, identity is no longer based on instability, but on divine relationship. A person begins to see themselves as held, guided, and covered. This shift in identity changes how challenges are interpreted. Instead of seeing challenges as threats, they begin to be seen as situations where God's strength can be revealed. Over time, fear begins to lose its authority, not because life becomes easier, but because the heart becomes stronger in truth. Courage is not the absence of difficulty, but the presence of trust in something greater than difficulty. When a person repeatedly returns to the truth that God is light, confusion loses its dominance. When a person repeatedly remembers that God is salvation, anxiety loses its grip. The repetition of truth gradually reshapes emotional responses. Even in moments where fear tries to return, the foundation remains steady. Emotional waves may rise, but they no longer determine direction. The heart learns to stand firm, not because it is strong in itself, but because it is anchored in something unshakable. Over time, this becomes a lifestyle rather than a momentary experience. Fear becomes something that is acknowledged but no longer obeyed. The deepest transformation in a human life begins when attention shifts from external struggles to internal alignment with the presence of God. Many people spend their lives trying to fix circumstances, rearrange outcomes, or remove difficulties, yet true peace is not found in the absence of problems. It is found in the presence of God becoming more real than the problems themselves. This is why dwelling in God's presence is not just a spiritual idea, but a practical foundation for emotional, mental, and spiritual stability. To dwell means to remain, to stay, and to make a place one's home. It is different from visiting. Many people visit spiritual moments through occasional prayer, brief reflections, or emotional experiences, but dwelling is continuous awareness. It is the decision to live with consciousness of God throughout daily life, not only in moments of crisis. When a person learns to dwell in God's presence, their internal environment begins to change even when external environments remain unchanged. Peace is no longer dependent on situations. It becomes rooted in relationship. One of the most important shifts that occurs when someone begins to dwell in God's presence is the change of focus. Human nature tends to magnify problems. The mind naturally gravitates toward what is missing, what is uncertain, or what feels threatening. But dwelling in God's presence retrains attention. Instead of constantly analyzing difficulties, the heart begins to recognize God's character, His faithfulness, and His sustaining power. This does not deny reality, but it reframes it. Problems are no longer the central focus. They become secondary to the awareness of God's nearness. To behold the beauty of the Lord is to recognize His nature beyond circumstances. Beauty here does not refer to physical appearance, but to attributes such as mercy, wisdom, patience, justice, and faithfulness. When a person begins to reflect on who God is rather than only what He can do, something profound changes within the soul. Gratitude begins to replace complaint. Trust begins to replace fear. Worship begins to replace anxiety. The heart becomes softened, and spiritual perception becomes clearer. The more a person beholds God's character, the less power external pressure has over their emotional stability. This process of beholding is not instant. It is developed over time through intentional focus. Just as the mind can be trained to worry through repetition, it can also be trained to trust through consistent reflection. When a person repeatedly returns to thoughts of God's faithfulness, those thoughts begin to shape emotional responses. Eventually, the mind begins to respond to situations with calmness rather than panic, because it has been conditioned to recognize God's presence as greater than the problem. Dwelling in God's presence also brings stability in decision-making. Many people experience confusion because they are trying to navigate life using limited understanding. But when a person is spiritually aligned, clarity begins to emerge from within. It is not always dramatic or immediate, but there is a steady sense of direction that develops over time. This clarity comes from intimacy, not information. The closer a person becomes to God in awareness, the more aligned their thoughts become with wisdom that is beyond human reasoning. Another powerful result of dwelling in God's presence is emotional healing. Anxiety, fear, and inner turmoil often lose their strength when a person consistently remains in awareness of divine presence. This does not mean challenges disappear, but the internal response to challenges changes. Instead of being overwhelmed, the heart becomes anchored. Instead of being shaken, the mind becomes steady. The presence of God acts like a stabilizing force that holds the inner world together even when external pressures attempt to pull it apart. There is also a quiet strength that develops in those who learn to dwell in God's presence. It is not loud or forceful, but it is deeply rooted. This strength allows a person to face uncertainty without being consumed by it. It enables endurance during seasons that feel long and difficult. It produces patience when answers are delayed. It creates resilience when circumstances do not change quickly. This strength is not self-generated. It is the result of continuous connection with God. Dwelling also transforms the way a person interprets life experiences. Instead of immediately labeling situations as good or bad, there is a deeper awareness that God is present within all seasons. Even in difficulty, there is a recognition that growth is taking place. Even in waiting, there is an understanding that preparation is happening. Even in silence, there is trust that God is still working. This perspective prevents discouragement from taking deep root because everything is filtered through the awareness of divine involvement. The beauty of this kind of life is that it does not depend on external perfection. A person can dwell in God's presence while still facing challenges, responsibilities, and pressures. In fact, it is within those very experiences that dwelling becomes most powerful. It is easy to feel peaceful when everything is going well, but true depth is revealed when peace remains steady even in difficulty. That is the evidence of a heart that has learned to remain in God rather than in circumstances. Over time, dwelling becomes less of an effort and more of a natural state. The mind begins to return to God throughout the day without forcing itself. Thoughts of gratitude arise more easily. Prayer becomes more natural. Awareness of God's presence becomes continuous rather than occasional. Life is no longer divided into spiritual moments and non-spiritual moments because everything becomes lived in awareness of God, trusting. God leads a person into a deeper dimension of peace that cannot be explained by external circumstances alone. It is not a passive state of waiting, but an active surrender of control, fear, and uncertainty into the hands of a sovereign God. Life often presents situations where human strength reaches its limit, where answers are not immediately visible, and where outcomes feel uncertain. In those moments, trust becomes the bridge between human limitation and divine intervention. It is the inner decision to believe that God is still working, even when nothing around seems to confirm it. Trust is not built in moments of comfort. It is formed in seasons of pressure. When everything is going smoothly, trust feels easy, almost natural. But when challenges arise, trust is tested, refined, and strengthened. This is where true spiritual maturity begins to emerge. A person who trusts God does not deny reality, but they refuse to allow reality to become greater than God's ability. Instead of focusing only on what is seen, trust focuses on what is unseen but promised. This shift in focuses changes the emotional and spiritual response to difficulty. One of the most powerful outcomes of trusting God is the release of anxiety. Anxiety is often rooted in the desire to control outcomes that are beyond human ability. The mind repeatedly tries to solve problems that have not yet been resolved, creating internal tension and emotional exhaustion. Trust interrupts this cycle. It says, even though I do not understand, I believe God is still in control. This surrender does not eliminate the situation immediately, but it removes the burden of carrying it alone. The heart begins to experience relief, not because the problem is gone, but because the weight has been transferred. Trusting God also transforms the way a person waits. Waiting is often one of the most difficult experiences for human nature. It challenges patience, tests endurance, and exposes inner fears. However, when waiting is combined with trust, it becomes a period of preparation rather than frustration. Instead of seeing delay as denial, trust sees delay as divine timing. This perspective changes emotional reactions. Frustration begins to decrease, and patience begins to grow. The heart learns that God's timing is not random but purposeful, even when it is not immediately understood. There is also a deep protection that comes with trusting God. Many fears in life are connected to the unknown. What will happen tomorrow? What decisions will bring? What outcomes may result? Trust does not provide every answer in advance, but it provides confidence in the one who holds every answer. This confidence creates emotional stability. Even when circumstances shift unexpectedly, the heart remains steady because its foundation is not in changing events, but in unchanging truth. Trust anchors the soul in something that cannot be moved by external instability. Trusting God also reshapes how a person views opposition. When challenges arise, it is easy to interpret them as signs of defeat or abandonment. But trust reframes opposition as part of a larger process. It recognizes that difficulties do not always mean failure. Sometimes they are part of formation. Through this lens, struggles become opportunities for growth, refinement, and deeper dependence on God. Instead of weakening faith, opposition becomes a tool that strengthens it. Another important aspect of trust is peace and decision-making. Life constantly requires choices, and not all decisions come with clear outcomes. In moments of uncertainty, fear can cause hesitation or impulsive action. But trust brings calmness into the decision-making process. It allows a person to move forward with confidence, not because every detail is known, but because Ode is believed to be guiding the path. This produces a sense of direction that is not based on anxiety, but on spiritual assurance. Trust also changes the way a person experiences emotional storms. There will always be moments of disappointment, delay, or unexpected change. However, trust acts like an inner anchor during these storms. While emotions may fluctuate, trust holds the deeper part of the soul steady. It does not prevent feelings from existing, but it prevents feelings from taking control. This creates a balance where emotions are acknowledged but not allowed to dominate decisions or perspectives. Over time, trusting God builds resilience. A person begins to realize that they have survived situations they once thought were impossible. This awareness strengthens faith for future challenges. Each experience of God's faithfulness becomes a testimony that reinforces trust. Gradually, fear loses its influence because evidence of God's help becomes more dominant in memory than fear of future unknowns. This creates a cycle of increasing confidence in God's ability. Trust also brings freedom from the pressure of outcomes. Many people carry the burden of trying to ensure that everything turns out perfectly according to their expectations. This pressure creates stress and emotional fatigue. Trust releases that burden by shifting responsibility from human hands to divine hands. It does not promote carelessness, but it removes unhealthy control. A person still acts responsibly, plans wisely, and makes decisions, but without the crushing weight of needing to control every result. There is also a deep sense of hope that grows within trust. Hope is not wishful thinking. It is confident expectation rooted in God's character. Even when circumstances appear discouraging, trust keeps hope alive. It says that current conditions are not final and that God is still able to bring change, restoration, and direction. This hope sustains the heart during long seasons and prevents despair from taking root. Trusting God ultimately leads a person into a life where peace is not dependent on understanding everything, but on believing in the one who understands everything. The entire message brings the heart to a single, powerful truth. Life is never meant to be carried in human strength alone, but in complete dependence on God, who is light, salvation, presence, and guidance. Fear loses its authority when God becomes the center of perception. Dwelling in His presence transforms the inner world from anxiety to peace, from confusion to clarity, and from instability to strength. Trusting Him shifts the weight of life from human shoulders to divine hands, where outcomes are no longer controlled by limitation, but held in perfect wisdom. In every season, whether in uncertainty, waiting, or opposition, God remains constant, faithful, and near. The soul that learns to rest in this reality discovers a peace that circumstances cannot destroy and a confidence that challenges cannot shake, because the foundation is no longer what is seen, but the one who is unseen, yet always present.